Welcome, Abril. It's really, really great to see you and to hear you. We've just had a little technical issue that we've overcome, so I'm glad that we can talk today. And we're going to talk about your experiences with Photovoice. And I'm really, really excited to learn more about the work that you've been doing. But it'd be great just to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the work that you do, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, Chris. It's great to see you and meet you. Um, so I am Abril Rios. I am a Mexican woman who is doing a PhD on migration studies at the University of Oxford. And I also work as a consultant on forced migration issues in Kenya. Um, so it is for my PhD and other personal projects for which I use Photovoice and other forms of participatory photography. I use it mainly with migrant women, trans women, and members of the LGBTQI community. And I have been using that here in Mexico, in the southern border, at the border with Guatemala, and then in Mexico City, and then in the north in Tijuana at the border with the US. So I have been using it to explore processes of empowerment and decision making amongst migrants who are crossing and settling in Mexico. You might know, you might have heard about it, but there are like tons and millions of Mexicans in the US, but turns out that there are also many Latin American and Caribbean migrants, and also Africans and Asians crossing Mexico, many of them trying to get to the US. But due to many restrictive policies, they find themselves in a stranded situation, and many of them end up staying here in Mexico. So that sounds like very oppressive and restrictive, but what I am looking more into is how they use their power, how they make strategic choices and advance their agendas to reach their own goals. And participatory photography is a great way to explore those very abstract issues and make it fun and not so serious and sad, because it is a sad situation. So yeah,
Mm.
that's a bit about me.
We'll talk about your work in a moment or shortly and get into some of that. But I'm like, what drew you to the context that you're working in? So you're in Mexico at the moment. What was it that initially drew you towards, the themes of migration and also gender that you mentioned?
Hmm.
What was it that brought you to these themes to explore?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I think it started with gender. I think from a very early age, I began to understand that bodies matter and the meanings attached to them can mean advantage and disadvantage. So I think I learned this when some classmates bullied a female family member because she had her period. So that made me realize that menstruating bodies can be bullied because of that. I was very young, about 7 years old.
Wow.
So later, when I was in high school, I did psychology studies. I experienced harassment myself. And it got me to think, how is it possible that I cannot feel safe even at university? So I went on and did a study on perceptions of violence and attitudes that justify violence against women. I was focusing mainly on cisgender women. So these attitudes, for example, that justify violence, for instance, a woman can be abused because of the clothes she's wearing, or things like that. And then the migration part also has a very personal root. And like every other Mexican, I have family members who migrated to the US without documents. So stories of going to the other side, that's how the narrative that we talk about when we say you go
Right.
to the other side, el otro lado, that's the US.
Right.
So one grows up with those narratives, no, and people going there with their documents and the facilitators or coyotes or smugglers that help people there. So I grew up with that. With this in my past and my interest in gender, I went on and did a research stay in the US where thanks to the support of a great researcher, Dr. Ana Ochoa Oleri, I explored strategies that Mexican women implement to access healthcare systems in the U.S. and when they are undocumented. So that sparked my interest into both gender and migration. So later on, I did a master's degree in migration, and I explored strategies of resistance to violence amongst displaced women in Sudan and then in Mexico. And you might think, what do those two countries in Africa and Latin America, what do those have to do? But it turns out that the strategies of resistance that displaced women implement in both countries are similar.
Mm.
So yeah, that's when the interest in South-South migration came in as well.
I feel like your journey is so far reaching in terms of geography. I'm quite intrigued by the sort of the scope and the scale of that. So was that you being present sort of on the ground in Sudan, and or was that via different organisations, or tell me a little bit about that, because I don't think I knew that part of your journey.
Yeah, yeah. So I did this master's degree in migration and intercultural relations, and through that program, I went to Sudan and to
Oh
Uganda.
wow.
So it was during that process of master's studies that I spent time in Sudan.
Hmm.
And when I was there, it was the first time I spent time in Africa, other than, tourism. So I started to notice interesting similarities between Mexico and Sudan. And that was what got me to think, well, there is something going on here. I could study
Mm.
this. Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that's what stood out for me when you just described a couple of minutes ago. Was that something that you noticed, that actually the factors that are prompting people to make that change in their life in terms of migrating to another country, or moving away from everything that they know, was that something you noticed, or was that something that people had already been aware of?
The the similarities or
Mm. Yeah,
the
yeah,
like what drives people to migrate, if there are some.
yeah.
Well, I think the drivers of migration are like multiple and intersectional, but there are probably some similarities across geographies, like one of them being the the high influence that northern powers have, to generalize, right? There are of course lots of diversity within regions, but this influence of northern powers over global southern uh, powers as well is very important, and it shapes people's mindsets.
Mm.
So I think on one side there is also precarity, violence, war, which drives people out of their communities. One cannot survive there. But then there is also this heavy narrative on West is best, or the North in this case is better. So those two combined drives people to move north. And when you are in a context where your life is at risk, where there is no job opportunities, there is not much that can keep you in those contexts. So
Mm.
that's what I'm doing here with, especially with Central American migrants. Central America is one of the most dangerous regions in the world. There is a presence of different gang members, but also state fragility and also intervention from from global northern powers, right? You have the intervention there in the US, of some European countries, Canada, even of Mexico, in Central America, that's pushing people out. Even though they don't want to leave, most of
Mm.
my collaborators say, I don't want to leave. I want to be in my home country. I want to be with my family. No, it's not my choice. But what am I going to do here? What kind of future can I give to my
Mm.
children, to myself? So these are, yeah, the drivers, some of them, right, of
Yeah.
migration. Yeah.
Thank you. I
Mm.
appreciate you sharing that, because I think um, I don't think it's something that is talked about a lot certainly in the when you look at stories in the mainstream media around, the emphasis is on the people making the journey, not the reasons why often, or those reasons why abstracted a lot and not spoken about in lots of detail. So that's quite.
Right.
I find that really interesting.
Um,
So you were talking about you'd been in Sudan, you'd had this experience, you'd made a connection around those links between migration in different areas. So bring us into the work that you've been doing in Mexico and around migration and sort of how did that all start? Was that part of your studies as continuing studies or
yeah. So I was. It started that my deeper work started. Sorry, in Mexico. It started through my master's degree. Um, then I stopped and I joined different organizations. One of them working on women's empowerment. Um, so that was the beginning of a move from focusing heavily on violence and oppression um, towards the expansion of agency and the ability to use hardship even um, to to move on, no? Resilience in a way or post-traumatic growth. So it was through that organization that I started to move to look more at those skills among people. Um, and it's also, I guess it's also important in in my own life story that one of the reasons that really hooked me into looking more at empowerment and beyond gender-based violence was um, again my very close family members. I discovered that a very close family member had suffered extreme forms of gender-based violence that had a huge impact on me. But I knew there was more than that. I saw a lot of strength and power and a lot of anger as well in me after having seen that experience. But I wanted to move beyond that. I later even discovered that I myself had been have been a survivor, sorry, of gender-based violence, and and I see that there is more than that in me, in myself, in my own life story. Um, so in a way that has that experience, that discovery of gender-based violence in my own life is it's helpful to connect with people who have gone through even more horrifying forms of violence. And that's how that is like a very deep personal link that I have with many migrants that I currently collaborate with in Mexico, but also in Kenya where I work, in Uganda where I used to work as well. So there is a very brutal side of it, which it's helpful to connect at a deep interpersonal level. Um, so that's what got me to move into the empowerment scene. So I, after working, doing these discoveries at the personal level, I went on and said like, yeah, I want to go back to university. Let me apply for a PhD, and I got into Oxford, thankfully. And I have to say, I started with Kenya. My project was based in Kenya. I thought I would never come back to Mexico. I thought
really?
I saw myself as a migrant. I
Okay.
spent years in Europe, about 8 years there. So I felt like, well, that's it. I'm not going back. Like I work in Kenya. I'm living here. My partner is not Mexican, so but slowly, and thanks to one of my examiners at the university, I started to question myself. Why do I want to do this in Kenya? Why? There are lots of migrants in Mexico. Mexico is now, in the last year, has become one of the main recipients of asylum applications in the world. This is something that not many people know. So
Right.
there are lots of refugees in Mexico as well. So I thought, like, well, I can do that there, and I can connect with Latin Americans at a different level, right? So I changed my focus from Kenya into Mexico, and then I also discovered participatory photography throughout my PhD journey. I took some courses and some talks, one with you, which was very inspiring.
Ah,
Thanks for that.
I'm not paying her to say that, so but I appreciate that. Thank you. It's nice to hear.
um, and because I was interested, sorry, in the process of change
Mm,
from oppression to using one's power and
yeah.
expanding agency. This is very abstract, so it is very difficult to talk about it in words.
But you you do a really good job of describing this stuff in a way that I definitely struggle to describe some of that. And what you said about people not being defined by the negative experiences that they've had, and even that word, migrant is in the UK context, it's used as a catch-all for all sorts of people in all sorts of situations, and it's not a positive label.
Yeah.
It's used as a negative. It's not a friendly label that people have applied. So I really resonated with what you said about acknowledging experiences but not being defined by them, and we'd say like focusing on people's strengths and the things that they can do rather than what you can't do, but not being limited by what's happened to you in the past, but acknowledging it as well, not ignoring it, but not being defined by it. So that really struck a chord with me to hear you describe not just your own experiences but then how you translate that into the relationships that you form with
Right.
people in projects
Right.
too.
Thanks. Yeah. I think words are incredibly powerful. Like a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes a truth.
Mm.
Um, but words have maybe can be overrated at some points, right? Like why is migrant negative? But no, white migrants are not migrants, right? They are expats.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah.
we're migrants, and it's okay. It's good to think and rethink
Mm,
the words. With some of my interlocutors, I would ask them, "What is to be a migrant?" And they're like, "Well, I'm a migrant.
mm,
I am
yeah.
one. Just look at me. This is the definition of a migrant." So just deconstructing what, but what is to be a migrant woman? What is to be a woman? What are
Mm,
the attachments on those meanings? And I think that's when participatory photography becomes so interesting, because it helps us think about um, these concepts that can be empty at some points, but then we fill them in with meaning. And
mm,
when one attaches an image to it, it's so much easier to talk even about difficult experiences. I find the process even a very therapeutic process in those group spaces where I facilitate processes of participatory photo voice. I use the narrative side as well. Um, Many women have opened up experiences in their lives that they have never ever talked about.
mm,
But just the fact of being in a group and seeing the images of others and others talking openly about it, it has helped them open up with deep, painful experiences, but in a liberating way of feeling, well, I'm not judged. Everyone here is also a migrant. Many of them have been um, abused in different ways, so there is anything that makes me an other.
mm,
So I think that's one of a very powerful factors of powerful sides of participatory photography. And as I was saying, these aspects of this process of change and expansion of agency, which I see as empowerment. Although empowerment is a very contested term, right? Like it is so heavy loaded.
yeah,
Empowerment can be anything, so I use it cautiously.
yeah.
um, but I mean it more as a process of transformation, of expanding one's capacity to make strategic life choices.
I think that's one of the things. I think when we initially spoke, certainly to hear you describe your work, I think we come from similar perspectives in terms of this work. That it's not really about conducting research, is it? This isn't about, or if anything, the people doing the research are the people participating in it, and they're not doing it to write a paper or conduct any kind of study. It's about self discovery, and so when you said about empowerment being a contested term, yeah, definitely, because you're not giving someone something they don't already have, but maybe just creating a space by which they can express whatever they want to express, and that's the empowerment piece. Is like you get to choose. I often say that to people is that this isn't about you must share the deepest, darkest, most significant kind of difficult thing. Maybe just whatever it is enough right now, and then but doing that with others is it might feel like a small thing to you, but it's not. It would be a big thing to somebody else to see.
Hmm.
that as well. So that really strikes a chord again. Well, I'm using strike a chord a lot. I think it's because you've got guitars in the background.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so the but it definitely connects with how I approach this way of working as well. That
Mhm.
it's so I like that aspect of your work and how you're approaching it. Definitely.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. But like, empowerment is not something one can give to another
Mm,
person. It's a personal process. It's a
yeah.
collective one that starts from oneself or from the group. I do believe there is an important element of self-reflection
Mm,
and critical consciousness. That this stuff comes from Paulo Freire,
yes.
the Brazilian. Um, so we must engage in these critical consciousness processes in order to move right from a state of of reflection towards acting and transforming. And I think yeah, but photography is a very important like tool, useful to help us reflect and to even imagine new scenes, new ways of living
Mm,
and being. And I really like also what you mentioned about like enable spaces where people can just explore and share whatever and up to the point they want. So I wanted to share one experience working with one of my collaborators. I suggested them to take a photo, a self-portrait without their face, right? And it was very difficult for her. She's an asylum seeker Venezuelan woman, and it took her a long time. Like everyone had their photos, and they were taking even more, right? So there is a moment in which everyone is like very excited with their cameras. And I saw her. She was like sitting down on a corner, and with the camera, and like I don't know what to do. There is nothing that represents me. I'm lost. Like I don't know who I am. I don't want to be in Mexico. I don't. Like, she was in Mexico City, which is very big. It's very interesting city, vibrant, but it can also be very intimidating.
mm,
So she was scared about going out and using the subway. She's like, I don't know who I am, and you're asking me to take a photo, a self-portrait, without my face. Like, it's just so difficult. But slowly she was like, okay, I'm blank. Like my mind is empty. So give me a white paper. Give me something white that can represent that emptiness that I'm
mm,
feeling. So slowly she started creating an image that could represent the way she was feeling at that moment.
mm,
And I think the process was very beautiful because the group also encouraged her to express what she was feeling. So slowly she took a white piece of cloth and she didn't like it. She just asked me, just draw a white square there because I was projecting the images of others as well. And so I was doing as she was telling me, and then others as well. Well, draw an outline. And what color do you want the outline to be? They said blue. Blue because blue represents hope. And that was her photo, a white square with a blue
wow.
outline, representing that emptiness and that feeling of being lost, right?
Mm,
That migration can be in some cases. Yeah.
wow. Amazing. I feel it would be great to see some photos. I know you've got some images to share with us, and for people who are listening
Sure.
on a podcast, we'll put a link perhaps to some of your work online where
How
people can see some examples. But for those looking on YouTube, we'll be able to see in a moment
great.
some of the photographs that people have created.
Of course. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah, it's just coming on now. Great. Yeah, it's
My,
working.
it's just my screen and not my notes, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Um, so I also wanted to share that I am very thankful about having been able to collaborate with some organizations in Tapachula, which is bordering Guatemala, and in Mexico City, and then also in Tijuana, the north, bordering the U.S. So these organizations opened their doors to this project, and they were interested in using Photovoice to work with migrants. So it wouldn't have been possible to do this without their support and their open doors. Um, and yeah, before showing one of some of the work of the women that I have been working with. Oh, sorry. Um, I wanted to show you some of the migration routes that my collaborators have used. So as you can see on this map, they have been all over the
Wow.
place, like from Haiti to South America all the way to Chile. Some of them hitchhiking, using buses, flying in the way, all the way through Central America, crossing the Darien Gap, which is one of the most dangerous jungles in the world, is dividing Colombia and Panama. So that many of them have crossed that on foot, making it to the south of Mexico and crossing all the country. And some of them have made it to the US and Canada. So this, in a way, is the narrative of the American dream. But it's important to also acknowledge that the American dream sometimes becomes a nightmare.
Mm.
For many of them who have made it even to the US, they say it is not so easy to live here. This is not how people say. It's difficult to find jobs. Some women work 18 hours per day cleaning. So definitely another contested term, right? The American dream is something we need to rethink. Similar experiences are faced by people from African countries or other areas of impoverished regions in the world who move on to Europe or other rich countries who also face some forms of exploitation and difficulties once they made it, right? In quotes. So as I was sharing, I have been developing some workshops with migrants and refugees in Mexico, and these are the phrases that I suggest to them for their photos. So self-portrait without my face, what's important for me, my past achievements, and my future goals. So the workshops were all participants were self-selected. They were invited openly, and they showed up to these 2-day workshops. So women created these images that represented themselves, what they value, their achievements and goals, and they reflected on various aspects. So this is one photo. I would like to share this one with you. It's from a Haitian young woman, and she reflected on her own capacity to overcome challenges and continue to move on. And she created this Photovoice. This photo represents domination despite life's problems, upheavals, difficulties. Despite the storms, I remain strong, and I will always be the queen and the domineering of all those who prevent me from moving forward. So this photo represents, power. And as I reflected on women's narratives, I realized that women in Tapachula, in Mexico City, in Tijuana, often make reference to their own power and capacity to keep on going. And they reflect on the importance of keeping on going without breaking, such that they can withstand the challenges that will continue to come. And some of them mentioned they would like to be strong like a rock, like this photo. Brenda, a Honduran refugee woman, she said, "This is how I want to be, strong like a stone." This is one of her goals. There's another image I wanted to share with you. So in our conversations, women overwhelmingly agree that having migrated has made them stronger and shown to them capacities that they did not imagine they had before. And this is portrayed in Saimi's photo. It's called "I Discovered Myself." And she said, "What you can see in the image is one of my achievements, since I had never done it before, screen printing. Before, I had only dedicated myself to taking care of children, and I discovered that I have much more to offer. I have many talents. Now I am and feel like a great, confident, and empowered woman." And this is some of her work, of her screen printing work. And this is the photo I just mentioned from one of my interlocutors when she was drawing a self-portrait. So she said, "In the middle of the whole process as a migrant, I feel lost and I can't find myself. The fear and uncertainty of not knowing how and when everything will end. The danger and everything to which we are exposed." So they often refer, some of my interlocutors often refer to their stay in Mexico as an experience of forced immobility. And many participants talked about this in the workshop. And a trans man, he reflected on this situation of forced immobility like this. He said, I see myself just as another migrant, people migrating who are keeping quiet and repressing themselves in fear of being recognized. We are prisoners in the midst of freedom. So this photo is very interesting because it partly reflects the role that Mexico has taken in migration dynamics in the Americas. So because of its geographical position, it has meant that the country is a buffer and an external border between Latin America and the US. And Tapachula, in the south of Mexico, that's an entry point where thousands of migrants get stranded and they face forced immobility as they need to wait there for documents that allow them to move throughout the country. And the only option for them to get documents is to apply for asylum. And the difficulty is that when you apply for asylum in Mexico, you must remain in the state or the county where you started your process. So this means that if you applied for asylum, in this case in Tapachula, you have to wait there until your process has been completed. And this process can take even a year. And that means they need to, find jobs and sustain themselves. And then moving throughout Mexico without documents, it's very difficult, mainly because of two reasons: the National Migration Institute and criminal groups. So irregular migrants who dare to move without documents in Mexico, they risk themselves to being caught by the National Migration Institute and being put in migratory stations, or they also risk themselves to fall in the hands of criminal groups. And it is well known that many women, men as well, at least get raped in those encounters with criminal groups. So as you can see, regular migration in Mexico is a matter of life or death, and this Photovoice represents that partly. So this is not an example of empowerment, but rather of disempowerment. There another important aspect that influences decision making in the process of moving is social networks. So family, friends, dependents. As I got to know women, they emphasize that social networks are key sources of energy that help them to keep on going and shape their decisions on which routes to take, where to settle, how to move, whether or not to continue. And also new networks and friendships. They may result in new travel plans that involve traveling together to reduce costs or to share caregiving responsibilities and help manage dangers on the route. There are also many other aspects that shape decision making and empowerment. But also another important role is or migrants organizing themselves and supporting each other, and also the support of organizations, committed civil society organizations. So yeah, this is just part of my work, and I wanted to also put up there my website and my contact in case people are interested in talking
Yeah,
more about
absolutely.
this.
Well, we'll post links
Great.
in all of the social media that we do around this, so people can get in touch with you directly to talk about it. I really love. I mean, I'm blown away by all of those images, but I mean the prisoners in the midst of freedom was a
Right.
line that really leapt out at me. As such a powerful statement. And you said that, yeah, I mean, you said they're not images of empowerment, but I don't know. I mean, I think there's something about the act of naming and expressing these things, which is certainly powerful, full of power. It has impact. It has, yeah, a really striking set of images. Thank you for sharing those with us, and just for sharing, giving us an insight into your work, really. So there's so much more that we could talk about, and I'm conscious of both of our times. I'm really interested to know um, a little more about where you're going with this, or where you'd like to go with this. So there's a body of work that's created. There are a whole host of people involved, and relationships formed, and what's your journey with this now? Where do you see things going in the future, sort of for yourself and for your work in this space?
No, thanks for that. That's a difficult question. Um, so I guess it's not going to be linear. Um, my immediate goal is to complete my PhD and make it as fun and collaborative as possible. So I plan to. One of my main interests is to show these images to the world and to
Mm,
connect with people emotionally. I think when one is able to look into other people's lives through the images that they took and their voices is such a powerful way to raise awareness, to reach decision makers, to advocate for migrants, for human rights. So really that's where I want to work more towards. I am very invested, very committed um, in migrants' rights, and I believe that migration is not a problem.
mm,
um, we are all migrants. Human evolution depends on migration. So migration will continue to happen, it's not a problem, and it can be empowering if we create the structures and the environments that enable people to flourish. We can make migration useful for entire countries. So there is a big emphasis on global northern countries facing so-called migration crises. But there is also migration movements occurring in the entire world. So I would like to look more also into those sectors and collaborate, erase that divide between North and
mm,
South, right? In the end, we're all
yeah.
migrants, we're all human beings.
Mm,
I don't believe that passports um, will end ever, but I think we can find and create ways of being more inclusive and
mm,
using the power of the passports in more inclusive ways, more respectful for life. So I would like to use this work to reach more people, to help raise awareness, and to help transform unequal power relations such that people don't have to forcibly migrate, but they can choose whether they want to migrate and move in and live in another place, or whether they can stay at home and live safely. So yeah, that's more or less where I want to go. I will be in the UK. I hope to be able to organize several exhibitions with you as well, and keep this growing. Also have some planned exhibitions in Mexico. So yeah, I see myself a bit of a research activist. I hope
yeah,
to keep
I
moving
like
there.
that term, a research activist. Well, yeah, I love what you said about using the images to break down barriers, and around inclusion and inclusivity, and I know we've spoken about perhaps co-hosting an exhibition, and I'd love to do that, and I love the idea of co-hosting something where people from different, completely different continents, different experiences, but then bringing that together in a space, and inviting people to come and see. So really, really excited to explore that further. Definitely. Be
Wonderful. That
amazing.
would be, yeah, indeed. Thank you so
Great.
much for
Okay.
the space and the opportunity to chat.
And I'm really, really grateful for your time, and just for sharing the amazing work that you've been involved in. Thank you very much.